My name is Helen Cannon. I'm the President of Voices of Bradfield, and we have the pleasure, along with our partners, Nicolette Boele and Kristen Hayward, of hosting this afternoon. You might ask, why is Voices of Bradfield hosting something to do with the Voice of Parliament? The answer to that is very simple. The Voices of Bradfield each year selects a number of priorities. One of their main priorities for 2023 was their support for the voice. If you look at your program, you will see that there are 5 speakers that we have listed. And you can see sitting behind me are 4 illustrious people who have given their time to us today. The 5th, Adam Davids, was unavoidably had to send his apologies. He unfortunately had to fly out of the country at very short notice during the week, so he is not able to join us today. Just a couple of things that I wanted to say by way of starting. In our life, we make decisions daily. Some of them are trivial, some of them we make without thinking about them, some of them are life-changing. We have before us, as a nation, the opportunity to make a decision that will change our nation for the better. So what we're going to do today is give you an opportunity to listen, to ask questions, and hopefully the decision that you make will be the best one for yourself, and we hope this fine country. The second thing I want to say by way of introduction is something to do with our mindset. I never thought I'd hear myself quote Susan Lay, the Deputy Opposition Leader, but here goes. Susan Lay has been noted for saying, if in doubt, vote no. Whereas Professor Anne Toomey, constitutional expert, has said, if in doubt, find out. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to find out a lot of things from the wonderful speakers that we have for you, and hopefully through the questioning that we will have towards the end of the afternoon, you will go away able to make a decision that is wise, informed, insightful, the right one for you and the right one for our country. So thank you very much for coming, and can I now introduce to you our first speaker, Desmond, who's going to talk to you, well, first of all, he's going to do the acknowledgement of country, and then he's going to talk to you about his journey and his knowledge of the ordered statement. I'm not going to read his bio, you have that in front of you, but there is something else you need to know about Desmond. This is the Coles magazine. In this magazine, there is a full page with Desmond on it. You know you're famous when you get a whole page to yourself. I also found out something else about Desmond that is not in his bio. I found it out by reading the Coles magazine. Desmond's secret vice is ice cream. But I'm here to say to Desmond, ice cream is not a vice, it's a food group. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to please welcome Desmond Campbell to the stage to do the acknowledgement of country.
Hello everyone, and I think Coles must have ran out of celebrity chefs to do a feature in their Coles magazine, because I'm not sure why I was there. But Sara Lee chocolate ice cream is definitely a favourite of mine. I may have taken a few selfies with the Coles magazine in front of Coles as well. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Firstly, make a round of applause for you spending the Sunday here all together. You'll all come here for different reasons, so give yourself a clap for that. Naikin Naka Kojok, Naikin Buringi Naka Jangla, Buganini Desmond, Naka CEO, work of the country. I just introduced myself in my language. My names, my tribes are the Naikin people, South East Land, as well as the Buringi people of South East, west of Campbell. My names are Jangla and Kojok, but don't worry, just call me Desmond, because that's also my name. And yeah, I'm here to do the acknowledgement and then go through a bit of a timeline of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So we come together on the lands of the Darramaragal people of the Darramaragal Warringah people. For thousands of years, these people have used this land great for hunting and fishing, and lived and existed and still exist on these lands, as well as many other lands and nations, not only in New South Wales but across Australia. As I mentioned, my people are the Buringi and the Malkin people. So I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and for allowing me as an Aboriginal follower from the Northern Territory to come on this country and do this acknowledgement and welcome you all here today. I want to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people that might be in the room, and pay my respects to those brothers and sisters, but also pay respects to each of you for, again, coming here on a Sunday and coming together and taking the time to really sit and listen and learn a bit more about this important thing that we're discussing, and what it means for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but also you as well. We're all Australians. The Constitution all affects us, and so it's great that we can be united in a room like this and have this conversation. So I want to pay my respects to each of you as well. So we get my notes up. So like I said, I'm going to go through, we could go really deep into the time frame, the timelines of the statement, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, but I probably am down to 5 minutes already, I reckon. But we will definitely have the opportunity to have Q&As. There's information out there if you want to go a bit deeper into the Uluru Statement. But where I wanted to start this time frame was much further back than 2017 when the Uluru Statement was done. I will get there, but I think it's important that we do just a very quick history time frame of all the previous statements and movements that happened in the past before 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart. So in 1967, everyone would know that that was a referendum that passed for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be included in the referendum, and the yes vote was at something around 98%. While I'm doing this time frame to the history, I'm also going to fix where I can provide a personal perspective and provide a personal insight into my family's involvement into this journey of constitutional recognition. So in '67, after that referendum happened, an uncle of mine by the name of Silas Roberts was, along with another, and he's passed away now, but I am able to say his name because I have permission, but he, with another elder from the Lumu tribe up in Arnhem Land, presented the Gidakala Bark petition to the Australian Government and Parliament House. I can't say that gentleman's name because he's not passed and I don't have permission to say his name. But it's in the history of them presenting this back in the 60s and 70s, presenting these bark. This is just one example of a bark petition, the Utica bark petition that was presented to the government. And in this petition, there was an invitation for government to work with the local Aboriginal people of that region to provide support to the Aboriginal people to understand how business can go onto their lands and be able to operate, such as mining companies going onto lands and operating on their land. So this was an invitation. It was an invitation to be united in working and living alongside each other. Unfortunately, that bark petition was put into a glass cabinet and put on show as if it's something that should be in the museum. Since then, there's been many more bark petitions. There have been many more movements where the community, Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander communities, have taken that step to reach out to government and understand how we can work together. So there's this huge journey. We had Vincent Mengiari from the Gurindji people, so I mentioned my motto, Gurindji. Vincent Mengiari led the Wakeful walk-off. This is Vincent Mengiari, my kinship is my great-great-grandfather. Like I said, my name is Jungwa from the Gurindji mob. So he led this 10-year protest on the lands of the Gurindji people. The best way to connect people into who the Gurindji people are is put your hand up if you've heard the song or sang along to the song From Little Things Big Things Grow. There you go. So this is a song that sings about this protest that Vincent Mengiari and his family led. For 10 years they led this protest to be able to have their land that was stolen from them and then sold to a man by the name of Lord Bestie, who was buying up land and turning them into cattle stations and making with Gurindji mob in particular, they were forced to work that land as stockmen and as cattlemen, and the men were as stockmen, the women were as domestic slaves. They weren't paid as non-Indigenous people working on that land. They were paid in sugar. We all know the story, right? They were paid in everything else except pay. And so over that 10 years, there was this discussion of wanting to get the same wages, and then across that 10 years, it then turned into actually we want our land back. And Dr Helen did that with the famous photo of Dr Helen pouring the sand into grandfather Vincent Mengiari's hands. So these are just some examples of how we got to where we are today. And there's many more. There's apart from bark petitions and movements, there's discrimination acts and other acts that also are a part of the story. And today I'll be talking about, throughout our discussions, talking about how the constitutional recognition, this referendum, is an opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have some form of equality when laws are made. It's an opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have voices where legislation is so important to work with them and not against them. So I think I'm probably at my time, but I'll hand over to the next speaker. But thank you, and I look forward to having a discussion.
Thank you very much to Desmond, and you will have a chance to ask him some questions later. Our next speaker is Dr Shireen Morris. You can see she has an exceedingly impressive biology. It's there for you to have a read on. I was lucky enough to hear Shireen speak a couple of weeks ago at the launch of Yes 23's campaign in Sydney at Prince Alfred Park. Shireen is a lawyer who specialises in our constitution. I don't know about you, but I have a family of lawyers and most of them are really boring. Shireen most definitely is not. She spoke when I heard her at Prince Alfred Park with passion and with great insight, and I know she will do that again today. Before I ask you to welcome her, I'm just going to show you this little bell. It's there so that we can keep a track of time. Desmond was perfect. I didn't need to even ring it. But we have given each speaker 9 minutes. So at the end of 8, I'll do a little ding, and at the end of 9, I'll get the hook and move them on from the microphone. So, can I ask you to welcome Shireen Morris?
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation to be with you here today. I too acknowledge the traditional owners of this area and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So as mentioned, I'm a constitutional lawyer. I'm of Indian and Fijian Indian heritage, but around about 12 years ago in 2011, as a law student, I went up to Cape York Peninsula and did an internship with the Aboriginal leader Noel Pearson at Cape York Institute. And he subsequently offered me a job working on Indigenous constitutional recognition. And I went on for the next 7 years to work with the Institute, and it's now been 12 years that I've been working on this issue. So the first thing that I learned from the people of Cape York was the history. And that is that in the 1800s, when the representatives of the colonies were negotiating to decide how to unite and create this new nation, Australia, not one single Indigenous representative was in those negotiations. And as a result, the Constitution that came into force in 1901 contained clauses specifically excluding them. Now, I describe the Constitution as a power-sharing compact because the Constitution is all about power. It distributes legal and political power in our country, and it regulates and sets out rules and principles for how power is exercised in our system of government. But for Indigenous Australians, it creates a situation of perpetual powerlessness. You know, the Uluru Statement talks about the torment of our powerlessness that Indigenous people experience. Well, the source of that powerlessness, in my view, is the Australian Constitution. It created a top-down power relationship with Indigenous people. And as a result of this top-down power relationship, for decades and decades, there were discriminatory laws and policies made about Indigenous people under the Constitution. Now, I'm talking about laws denying Indigenous people the vote in some jurisdictions right up until the 60s, laws denying them equal wages, sometimes paying non-existent wages for their hard work, as Desmond was just talking about, policies splitting families up, removing children, sometimes banning their languages from being spoken, sometimes controlling where they could live, who they could marry, and of course denying their property rights. And even though most of that harsh discrimination is now mostly in the past, today governments with good intentions make laws and policies about Indigenous communities, but they often misunderstand the needs and situations of those communities. And so as a result, despite a lot of goodwill and despite money spent, Australia is failing miserably to close the gap. And in some indicators, the gap's actually getting wider. So this is an abominable state that we're in. Now, as a result of that history, as Desmond said, for decades and decades, Indigenous Australians have called for substantive and empowering constitutional recognition. Not a preamble, not something symbolic that would make no difference to their lives, but something substantive that would change this top-down power relationship into a more equal partnership power relationship. And there have been decades of petitions and letters to kings and prime ministers calling for a stronger voice in their affairs. Now, rewind back to 2012, when I was fresh out of law school. In my naivety, I looked at the racially discriminatory provisions in the Constitution, and I looked at the history, and I thought, you know what we need is a racial non-discrimination guarantee. We need an equality guarantee, like other constitutions have in their Bills of Rights. except Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights, and we've got no equality guarantee. We've got the opposite. We've got constitutional provisions saying discrimination is allowed. So I said, let's have an equality guarantee. And Campbell Institute pushed that proposal, and Noel was on the expert panel at that time that Julia Gillard put together, and they adopted that proposal and proposed it in their final report. But then, when the report was published in 2012, we got this massive political wake-up call. The right, political right and Conservatives said, no, that's a one-clause Bill of Rights, they said. We don't want to change the Constitution in that way because that would transfer power away from Parliament to the High Court, and it would enable the High Court to strike down laws that they felt would be discriminatory. And so Noel said to me, look, let's rethink this whole thing. He said, support across the political spectrum is very important, so let's find a way to address these conservative concerns while still achieving what Indigenous people want, which is substantive constitutional recognition that ensures laws and policies are made in a better way. And so we went through this extraordinary process of engaging with those Conservatives who were hammering us most hard about this so-called one-clause Bill of Rights that we were pushing. And that was people like now Liberal MP Julian Leeser and other constitutional Conservatives like the Professor Anne Toomey at Sydney University, who you mentioned. And we said to them, come on guys, you have to admit the Constitution has presided over a lot of discrimination in relation to Indigenous people. And they said, yes, it has. We just don't think your solution is appropriate because we don't think that the High Court should be striking down Parliament's laws. We think it's up to Parliament to make those policy decisions. So we said, okay, well, help us come up with a better solution that doesn't give power to the High Court, that keeps Parliament in charge, but that still gives Indigenous people the guarantee that they're looking for, that laws and policies will be made in a better way. This was in 2014. And it's through that engagement with Conservatives that this alternative idea emerged, that perhaps you could change the Constitution to guarantee that Indigenous people would be heard. So change the Constitution to require Parliament to establish an Indigenous advisory body that would give Indigenous people a better say right at the start when Parliament's making those laws and policies about Indigenous people, right? So instead of giving power to the High Court to decide what's good or bad policy, you could empower Indigenous communities themselves to have a fairer say right at the start when those laws and policies were being created. Now, as much as it annoys me to admit it, those Conservatives actually led us to a better proposal, right? One that was much more in keeping with that long history of Indigenous advocacy for a greater voice in their affairs. Now, fast forward to 2017. The Uluru Statement from the Heart culminated decades of Indigenous advocacy for a stronger voice in their affairs, and they forged the first ever national Indigenous consensus on how they want to be constitutionally recognised. And pragmatically, they asked for a voice. They assessed the options. So they looked at the idea of a symbolic preamble. They said, no, we don't want that because that would make no difference to our lives. That won't help close the gap. They looked at the idea of a racial non-discrimination guarantee that we were pushing, and they said, no, we don't want that. They said, we want a voice so that when politicians often far off Canberra are making decisions and laws and policies about our communities should have a guaranteed say. The last thing I want to say is about the constitutional drafting. Back in 2014, we sat down with the most conservative defenders of the Australian Constitution and negotiated every word of an amendment that could require Parliament to establish an Indigenous advisory body that would uphold the Constitution and respect parliamentary supremacy. And those constitutional Conservatives agreed that that was a modest and practical amendment in keeping with the Constitution. Julian Leeser wrote in 2016, he said, this is the kind of clause that Griffith and Barton might have drafted had they turned their minds to it. Griffith and Barton being the original founders of the Australian Constitution. And it is a constitutionally conservative, modest proposal. And by the way, the inclusion of the Voice's ability to give advice to the executive government was there from the start, and it was in fact emphasised, it was Conservatives who emphasised to us the importance of the Voice having a constitutionally mandated role advising the executive as well as Parliament. In fact, Julie and Lisa said to us, it's very important that the Voice engages with executive government. If it only engages with Parliament, it won't have enough practical impact. He said because by the time policy positions reach Parliament, they're very locked in, difficult to change. To have real practical impact, this body needs to advise on policy development as well, right? But this is a constitutionally conservative amendment. Because think about it, the Australian Constitution is all about voices. In 1901, when those colonies came together to unite to create the Commonwealth of Australia, they guaranteed each of those colonies an equal voice in their affairs. That's why Tasmania, tiny state like Tasmania, gets an equal number of senators as New South Wales. Because our Constitution is founded in the principle that the historic political communities deserve a fair voice in their own affairs, even the very small historic political communities. But because of the discrimination of that era, the First Nations, the most ancient of political communities, was not recognised and was not given a voice. Now this referendum is about correcting that omission, doing it in a conservative, modest, practical and pragmatic way, but in a way that is empowering and that will create real change on the ground for Indigenous people. This boils down to a yes or no question. Do we think Indigenous communities deserve to be recognised in the Constitution from which they were omitted in 1901 by having a guaranteed advisory voice when Parliament and government makes laws about them? Recognition and a guaranteed voice. Do we say yes or do we say no? We want things to stay the same. That's the question we have to decide in a few months' time, and I hope and I think that Australians will make the right decision and vote yes. Thank you.
Confess, I let that go a little early time, but wasn't it brilliant and so clear? Our next speaker needs little introduction, and you have her extremely impressive bio on your sheet. I feel that Zali Steggall has managed to put about 10 lives in the one life that she's only partly led at this stage. She's been something of everything. She's an Olympian, she's a barrister, and she is here today because she is a member of the House of Representatives. And she's going to be able to talk to us as an insider to let us know some of the things that we don't necessarily understand about how Parliament will work and how the Voice has the opportunity to enhance decision making. So, Zali, thank you.
Thank you. What a fantastic constitutional recap. If I could start by paying my respects also to traditional elders, past, present, in particular those in the room, and acknowledge their incredible care of country, land and sea. And we do know our resources, our environment are finite, and we do need to make sure we take incredible care of it. And it is in recognising that the first Australians, our Indigenous elders, that care for country was a core and central value for them, and it is incredibly important. So it's pretty exciting to be here. You are in Bradfield, my neighbouring electorate, and I think it's an amazing opportunity to talk about what will this mean in practice. I have long campaigned for support for the Uluru Statement. My community in Warringah were incredibly but it's an important document because it really highlights some incredible inequities, some issues. Indigenous Australians are the most incarcerated in the world. Now, they are not intrinsically criminal, so what is it that is resulting in that outcome? They're the kind of questions I think we all have to ask ourselves. How did we get here? What is it work? Is the status quo working? Can we do better? The Uluru Statement ultimately is a generous invitation, and it's an invitation to all of us individuals. And I say me as an individual, not as a politician, not as a member of Parliament, because it wasn't written to politicians, it was written to the Australian people as a really, I think, generous invitation. Now, we seem to have in this debate a fair consensus that constitutional recognition is important. We acknowledge that it is something that is missing, and as Shireen just highlighted, it's missing from our constitution. The question seems to be around the effect or the wording of that amendment. And I'd have to say, as a lawyer, as a barrister, and as a member of Parliament, I absolutely do feel this is the right wording, and I have really good reasons why. So, in my last 4 years of being a member of Parliament, I've had the opportunity to vote, to debate on legislation. I guess as an independent, I don't have big party groups behind me, but I do go and seek out information and briefings around legislation and what it's going to mean. And a key one that stands out for me was the cashless debit card. Now, this was a proposal. It was an income management program for people receiving Centrelink payments and prohibited their use of funds for the purchase of alcohol, gambling and tobacco products. It was introduced in limited communities, and it had a discriminatory aspect in that because it was mostly targeting Indigenous communities like Northern Territory, Cape York, Bundaberg, Harvey Bay, Ceduna. But coming from a family law background, I was really concerned about the impact on domestic violence when it comes to alcohol and those kind of areas of violence. So I was looking for a solution or for a program that could make a difference. But it was incredibly hard to access advice on how effective will this proposal be on the ground. Had there been consultation? How will it be rolled out? Will the proposal and the wraparound services actually work? So the bill initially was a trial, and I gave it the benefit of the doubt. I supported it because I wanted to see improvement in those aspects. But unfortunately, when it came to then looking at do we make this a permanent change, there simply wasn't any data. There wasn't any evidence to show that it had worked. I reviewed the material presented to the Senate inquiry. I discussed the issue with Prospect College. I met with the minister and staff. I heard from many voices within Warringah, but I couldn't get real advice as to the consequences on the ground. I went to meet with Minister Wyatt at the time under the Morrison government. I met with the opposition minister, and all I got was a really politicised response to the program. Everyone was absolutely sticking to their corner from a political ideology point of view, rather than saying, is this policy working? What are its benefits? What are its costs? Where are the questions? There was a report commissioned by government, but it wasn't released, so we couldn't even see whether or not that policy had worked. The anecdotal evidence that the card had achieved some reductions in areas of concerns, well, the problem is we couldn't access it, and there wasn't anything underpinning the broad powers provided by the legislation. So it was incredibly hard to form a view, and that is just a really practical example of a policy that cost a lot of money, that was intended to achieve a goal. That was supposed to have a certain amount of wraparound services, and it was practically impossible as a member of Parliament to cut away the political adversarial approach from government and opposition and get to the nuts and the base of that policy of whether it was actually working. And that's just one policy that's come up. There are many others that come up. And from my point of view, I would have absolutely benefited from a voice, from an advisory body that could come to me, to the Parliament, to give me the information on the ground, whether it worked, what wraparound services should have been or were promised to be rolled out that hadn't, what were the statistics, what were the facts, what were the things that could have been tweaked, how could this program and policy have been delivered better and be more productive. So for me, it was unequivocal that an advisory body would have absolutely made a difference in that delivery of that program. The input of the voice and their perspective on the impact of Indigenous communities, in particular policies in that decision-making process, think would have been really, really important, made a huge difference. It adds a really valuable layer of interpretation to data when we look at, is a policy working on the ground? And that's just one. So other programs, of course, we've heard, like stolen generations, removal of children. When we look at so many policies, there's no doubt that with better interaction and consultation on the ground, we can in fact make them better. I have to raise a positive example where consultation and working with people on the ground worked. During COVID, there was great fear that Indigenous communities would be absolutely impacted because there are so many comorbidity aspects that were really putting at risk great impact. But there, unusually, there was consultation and listening to people on the ground, and it resulted in a complete reversal. Indigenous communities had a much lower impact when it came to hospitalisation, deaths and cases of COVID, and that's because the government listened. Now, of course, the question is, if they did it once, would they do it all the time? Unfortunately, history shows us that advisory bodies come and go with governments. They get put on, they get changed from the next government, and you lose the knowledge, you lose the experience. The continuation of the constitutional aspect of the laws will enable it to be there, that advice for policy, for efficiency and effectiveness will be there. It's really important to remember that the power maintains all the control ultimately. Government to government will change the structure of the voice. It's the only permanent aspect will be the fact that it will be there, that advice may be given. It's not a must. So if I could ask everybody to do something, is read the words of the constitutional amendment proposal. Read what it says. It says may advise. It does not say must. It does not say must be followed. It simply says may advise. And lastly, I'd like everyone to just have a look at the Constitution. Now, this is not about, this is a pocket edition of the Australian Constitution, okay? It is not a huge document of detail. In fact, when it comes to the executive powers of government, there are 2 pages, right? That is all it is. It is a power sharing document and the detail is determined by parliaments. On defence, there's all of 3 pages, right? So it's simply, I think, misleading to say that everything is done up front or the Constitution contains everything. There are copies of these available at your local member. Go and check them out. They're published by the Parliament. This is the edition. This is your Constitution. You have the power to make it reflect you. As Shireen said, in 1901, women, and I see many women in the room here, were not consulted and did not have a vote, did not have a voice. First Nations Australians were not consulted, did not have a voice and did not have a vote for many, many years. We can't change the past, but we certainly can ensure a better future. So I urge everyone, look deep in your hearts and do what's right.
I think it's an opportune moment to remind us all that these wonderful people are all here pro bono. They are here to talk to us, no payment, nothing expected. They just want to make sure that you get the best information. Our last speaker is Nicolette Boele, and without Nicolette's assistance and support, I doubt that any of you would be here, because Nicolette's team helped pay for the 60,000 leaflets and that we dropped all over Bradfield, and her team of volunteers were the ones who distributed it. So our thanks to Nicolette for all the support to get us there. As well as Nicolette's impressive bio, I would add this. Nicolette was the woman who turned Bradfield marginal.
Hey, I would like to echo what's already been said about paying respects to traditional owners, past and present, and emerging, particularly the ones here today. I can't believe the descendant from my biggest hero. And also thank you to everybody for turning up today, yeah, because this is what civics is all about. This is about turning up and becoming informed, it's about engaging. This is democracy, so thank you to everybody for turning up today. Full disclosure, I will be voting yes. I find myself now also campaigning for a yes outcome. This wasn't always the case. I had intended to be agnostic and sort of put my shoulder to the wheel and to run, I suppose, a campaign about what is a referendum about and the mechanics of that. I had not intended to campaign yes. It was when Bradfield's current Member of Parliament, who's a member of the opposition front bench, showed his hand in solidarity to the Liberal National Party position to run a no campaign, that forced my hand to run and to join the great people involved in the Yes 23 campaign. I can't look into the hearts and minds of those people that are arguing no. I just have to accept that they make those arguments. Some of them are in good faith, and some are not. But I think it's kind of pointless to interrogate that. I'd rather make a yes case from first principles. And the very, very first principle is that what we as a nation have been doing, purportedly for Indigenous people, for our brothers and sisters there and for their children and for their grandchildren, just hasn't worked. The gaps haven't closed fast enough. Some have even worsened. Youth incarceration is ridiculously high, and life expectancy remains stubbornly low. So we've just got to try something else, right? And when you're in a hole, you stop digging. So let's try something else, something that ushers in the dispossessed and the injured into the decisions that impact them. They're not going to be lecturing us or drive home that we today are not responsible for our ancestors do. We know that. It's to remind us that we're absolutely responsible for what is happening now. And so it's, you know, if this, guys, is virtue signalling, I'm up here with a megaphone and big flags, and if this is moral posturing, I'm in a downward dog doing hot yoga. Because why I'm choosing yes? I'm choosing yes because I think the voice shall raise the quality of decision making, what Zali was talking about. The voice shall raise the quality of decision making on matters that relate to Indigenous peoples and their children and their grandchildren, about health and housing and education and employment. And the voice shall raise the quality of decision making on matters that impact Indigenous peoples for their benefit and therefore the benefit of all Australians. Because when some gain, it doesn't necessarily mean that others lose. And outside the competitive world of business, we live in a society that's made up of communities, and those communities are families and people. And when we are all educated, when we are all housed, when we are healthy and employed, our whole society benefits, it thrives. So in this regard, as Australians, we're only as strong as the weakest link. And personally, I find it really morally and practically difficult to lecture the Chinese government on its human rights records when we as Australians indefinitely hold refugees in detention. I also find it really hard when I look at our Indigenous youth incarceration rate, which is 6.5 times that of non-Indigenous youth. Those 10 to 17-year-old children, they're people, not just statistics, they are people's children and their grandchildren. And it's not because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are naughtier than non-Indigenous children, and it's also not because there's some recessive gene that makes them more susceptible to mischief. It's because they're born into, so many of them, disadvantage, systemic disadvantage. 30% of Indigenous households live in poverty compared to 16% non-Indigenous. 70% of Indigenous people rent compared to 31% of the whole of Australia. How can we expect these people to get out of the poverty cycle with those kinds of statistics? Maybe it's if we start to listen to their experiences, their ideas and suggestions. Perhaps we can start to turn a corner. So before the bell goes, I just want to take a moment to think about what happens if we do vote no, which of course you can do. It's obviously everyone's choice to vote the way you wish to vote. But voting no doesn't mean saying yes to an alternative. There is no other model that's been put in front of the Australian people in October or November this year. There is no treaty for which we will be voting. No other model is being offered. And so if we vote no, it means we are voting to do nothing. It means we are voting for the same, and that we accept the status quo. Proudly choosing yes is recognising that we want change. It's recognising that listening, that simply listening to our First Peoples is a step that, frankly, we've really never taken seriously. It's not granting extra votes and special representations. It's ensuring that we institutionalise what we should have been doing anyway. In the past, on those few occasions when we as a nation have approached giving First Peoples the respect that they deserve as Australians, as equals of the people who purport to represent them, we've been really quick to take away when we've been confronted. We've been really, really good at not listening. So it's little wonder that the people who join the Order state will be hard, that their muscle memory, that they're really fearful of Indigenous people to hold them there. It's why, in my opinion, the voice has to be in the Constitution so that it can't be removed at the whim of a Prime Minister who's momentarily in power. It can only be removed by the will of the people, and hopefully just maybe our grandkids or maybe even our kids get to do that in their lifetime because the voice has worked and the gaps are closed. We can remove the voice in the Constitution. We truly find ourselves walking together towards a common future. And then just really finally, a word about the Constitution. I am not a constitutional lawyer, and I am not fun. There has been a tendency, especially in our media, to speak of the Constitution, in reverential terms. I'm talking about a big C, capital C, the Constitution. With this worshipful intonations, many have in the USA, like they have in the USA for their own Constitution. In this rendering, referendums are tantamount to heresy, to calling into question the wisdoms of the founding fathers, and it's another phrase that's also Americanism. Our Constitution is a solid document, but as been said already, it's a product of the 19th century. It's the result of an agreement between white men living in Australia who did not think of themselves as Australians and the British Parliament. And in no sense is our Constitution a guide for the future. It's a very solid foundation upon which to renovate. And a vote for yes is not a grand design, but a vote for yes is a sensible renovation. So what you're being asked to do is to vote on a treaty or another model. It's far simpler than that. It's whether you agree or you disagree to establishing an entity, enshrining in our Constitution the establishment of an entity to inform government. So please, read the resources available via the Assembly website, apply critical thinking to information, air quotes, published by both campaigns. In my opinion, much of the material come from the No campaign is unsubstantiated misinformation and designed to cause fear and confusion. And please, if you are a yes, please join me and others right across the political spectrum to pledge your support for the S23 campaign via the website. Let's celebrate and congratulate what we have achieved so far in reconciliation, and let's take a brave stance to take this further and faster than choosing yes. It's time to build a better future with and alongside First Peoples of Australia and their children. Because together, better is possible.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. We now come to the opportunity for you to ask questions of any of the people who are here on the stage. I'm going to hand the microphone over to my friend and colleague, Kristen Hayward. Kristen has also partnered with us to make sure that all of those leaflets got out into the letterboxes of Bradfield. You don't have Kristen's bio, so I'll just give you a very quick understanding of who she is. She runs a leadership consultancy business called People for Success. It educates managers to connect with and act on their values. She's a published poet, a local conservationist, and she runs a not-for-profit organisation that supports women to grow in confidence and stand in their power. She was also the community independent candidate for the seat of Warringah in the New South Wales election. So, Kristen, over to you.
Thank you, Helen. That was a very, very kind introduction. So what I am going to do now is simply field your questions and direct those questions to our experts, our panellists up the front. So who would like to go first? Well, that was quick. All right, so you, sir, get the first question. I'm staying away from that.
This is a question for Desmond. About 7 years ago, we had Return to Nation for the Indigenous populations. Is it not true that there was no consensus as to the movement forward in terms of the Indigenous population? I know this because I was Sue Green, who's an elder from the Wiradjuri, who has spoken about it at length. How can we be assured that the voice to parliamentarians is going to be a consensus of that? And is it not better for us to do what we were told earlier about a consensus, a more pragmatic approach to legislation, like talking to Indigenous populations when we are establishing that? Is the voice necessary? And secondly, what would it mean for you, Desmond, if you came out with a no vote?
Thank you. And if you think if somebody else would also like to answer that, you can. Desmond?
Thank you. I'm happy to respond and open it up if others do, but absolutely, because we are all Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people, it doesn't mean we all approach and have the same opinion, and I think that's something worth celebrating. It's absolutely a strength that we're able to approach important things such as constitutional recognition, voice to Parliament, and we're able to, as a community of over 250 different groups, can have that conversation. And it's so important that non-Indigenous Australians are understanding more and more that we are one voice of many voices. And this is just that example of how important it is that you are acknowledging that and you are wanting to make sure you do the right thing. To answer the second half of your question on what a no, if the outcome was a no outcome, I'll answer that from a personal experience because I'm not a politician, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I'm not an athlete and everything else you are. However, I do have lived experiences in all the areas that will make a change for the yes outcome. I remember when I was in school, I was learning Indonesian. This is a school up in the Northern Territory with 85% of Aboriginal students. We were learning Indonesian. I was so proud of learning another language. I went home and told my mum. My mum thought, oh, great, maybe I can come to the school and teach and she was threatened with trespassing. She wasn't going to do that. It was in the curriculum that we had to learn Indonesian and no other language. That really scared my mum into speaking language in our home. That really scared my mum in being able to allow us to have access to our culture. If it wasn't for another family member that secretly taught me some language, I would not know my language today. My mum to this day still doesn't speak a lot of her language. And there's only times where I catch her talking language, or it'll come out when she's talking to another family member. Another example of what a no outcome might look like, based on my past experiences, is housing. It is so hard for rural and remote Aboriginal people to have access to suitable housing, to have access to maintenance. I have many family members that are living in overcrowded situations where they're having to share housing only because they want to live on their country. The other area is employment. I'm the youngest of 14 children, where I was the only one that was able to go through the education system, go on to further education, and go on to employment. But what was that a sacrifice of? It meant that I couldn't go on country. It meant that I went through schooling, an education system that didn't acknowledge who I was, or who my people were, or the history of Australia. I had a principal that actually taught my SOS class and said to everyone in that class, this is not the history, the true history, what I have to teach you. But by law, I have to teach you this. We're in year 11 and 12. He said, I challenge you to go outside this classroom and look deeper into what the Australian history is. So that's just another example of how the system has been working against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There's many other examples where there's opportunities for what a world with a no vote will look like. And the stats are all there. The speakers here have gone into some of those stats. I've worked in the justice system. I've worked with young people in the justice system. I've worked with women, both Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous women that have experienced domestic and family violence. The stats, they're not getting any better. They're getting worse and worse in some areas. As mentioned, we're closing the gap targets. There's an opportunity here, if we're going to talk about domestic and family violence as an example. There's an opportunity here for experts to feed into a representative to discuss how laws can work to protect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, how laws can protect culture and language and being taught in school, how laws can protect the choice to live on country. So just to go back to your first question, yes, there are many opinions on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people approaching the voice to Parliament, but that's something to definitely celebrate, and I encourage you to hear those different opinions. From my perspective, and a lot of my family and my community's perspective, this is a better outcome to have a yes outcome.
Thank you so much. I would like to first of all recognise that deeply moving and personal story of Desmond. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, the lived experience, and also hoping that we get truth-telling at school, which is what all of us are craving for, the truth to be told in history. So there's a question here, I noticed here.
Hi everyone, I'm Dad. I live on Rosedale Road, so groceries afterwards, and this is good timing. Look, I'm someone who desperately would like to vote yes. Currently don't intend to. I have so many questions, frankly, I don't even know where to start, so I'll just put... Yeah, so I can actually summarise it into one question. In something that's so important, and I honestly believe it is, and I know you all do, why isn't there more detailed mechanism for people like me who really need it before they'll vote for it?
Thank you for that. Look, it's very, very important to understand the Constitution is about principle, right? The Constitution is about principle. Remember at the start when I said the Constitution is Australia's highest legal rule book? So the Constitution sets in place high-level principles, rules that dictate the way Australia is governed. The other thing it does is it requires Parliament to set up some key institutions, right? So the Constitution tells Parliament, set up this institution, like the High Court, right? Or set up this other institution. What the Constitution doesn't do is set out details, right? So the Constitution tells Parliament, set up this institution like the High Court. Then the Parliament enacts legislation which sets out the detailed functioning and operation of the High Court. And to me that's important because what you put in the Constitution is locked in and permanent, but what gets enacted in detail is flexible. And that's important because institutions need to evolve and change over time, right? So that's the first thing I would say is that the Constitution is about principle. And this boils down to a yes or no principle, right? Are we saying yes to recognising Indigenous people in the Constitution by giving them a voice in their affairs? Not a veto, just an advisory voice when Parliament and government makes laws and policies about Indigenous affairs. If we vote yes to that, then Parliament will have to enact the details about how that will work, and it will need to change those details over time. So in a sense, it would be kind of dishonest if government said to us, here are all the details about how this would operate. And I say that would be kind of dishonest because actually it's not up to the government to say that, because when it goes through Parliament it might change. The Teals might change it, the Greens might change it, the Liberals might change it, and a future Parliament might scrap it and redo it. A good example, right, that Noel Pearson always uses this example, there's a power in the Constitution that gives Parliament power to set up the ABC, right? There's a short little clause in the Constitution. Parliament uses that power to set up the Aboriginal Broadcasting Corporation Act. But there have been something like 5 different versions of that act, and changed titles, changed operations, etc. Right? It would be very strange and cumbersome and not workable if all the details of the ABC were in the Constitution. Yes or no? This is a yes or no question. Do we want to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution from which they were omitted in 1901 by ensuring that they have a voice when Parliament and government make laws and policies about them? That's the principle we've got to decide on. If we say yes, then it's up to Parliament to decide the details.
Thank you so much. Can I just add to that? It's really interesting, that question of the detail. It's sort of that fear, but can I say, even sitting in Parliament when bills are first introduced, there's an explanatory memorandum, there will have been maybe an inquiry, maybe an investigation into the issue that the legislation has been put forward to. Now the government Parliament has the power to deal with that issue because of the Constitution, and then it will change, as Shireen said. For example, from government to government, you don't always have the same name of ministries, the same ministers or the same departments. They change over time depending on the priorities of the government. And I guess that's the issue here is, from government to government, the priority of how money is spent and programs and policies are developed for First Nations Australians changes. The question is that it should always be a process of advice. It's not locked in how that process will be. So different governments and different persuasion will approach it in different ways. And that is how how we have always governed. That is how Australia is governed. It's how policies are made, how government is detailed.
Sorry, can I just add a final to that? I understand the legislative process or constitutional legislation. I get all of it, but I have a very different view, which is that the first instance you put a major change to people, whether it's at constitutional level, legislative, or otherwise, it's incumbent upon you to explain it. I don't accept that.
All right, I just don't know if you could say any more to that. I thought you were actually very clear. What was the principle, and maybe just a couple of
Can I
words.
just quickly respond to that? I think people have explained it, right? And I think it's also important that we as Australians, if we don't have enough information and you want more information, I do think it's important that we proactively get the information. There is information out there. We have the words of the constitutional amendment that's available. Read it. Have a read. It says there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. It says it may make representations to the Parliament and the executive government. And then it says that Parliament will have the power to control all the matters relating to the voice, right? So it's pretty easy to understand it. Go out and read the information. We also do know some key principles about how the voice will likely operate because the government has outlined 8 key principles. For example, we know it will be chosen by Indigenous communities. We know it will be anchored in local and regional Indigenous communities. Right, so there's some key, we know it will have gender balance in its membership. These are the intentions of the current government. So I think there is sufficient information out there to go and to make a really informed decision here. But if we think this is a fair proposition, I think we as good-willed Australians need to access information, make an effort to understand it, and then proactively share it. Discuss it, share it, and I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, sir, if you've got more questions. Very happy to. Thank you.
Further to the previous question, surely there are certain basic details which should be available. For example, who will make the decisions and how will those decisions be made. If we can't have certain basic details like that, surely it would have been better to have had a constitutional convention to thrash out some of these issues.
It's really important to understand the concern. What are the decisions that you're referring to? So is it the decision to make...
Well, the decisions of what advice to make to government.
Okay, but we know from the guiding principles it's to address policy areas that directly impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the decision of that body, which will be representatives from communities, from the local, state, community and regional, the principles identify that it should have gender equity, that there should be regions and urbans and all kind of geographic areas represented. They will look to the issues and policies, the areas like the closing the gap where they're not moving, so incarceration, health, housing, life expectancy. I mean, these are basic human rights or standards that are just the difference between the lifestyle of the standard of living that we enjoy compared to what is being experienced, not in a third world country, not in some undeveloped world far away, but here in Australia. And we have for years, governments for years with good intentions have been trying to fix that and have failed. So I think the really basic question is, do we continue with the status quo or do we look to do something better, differently? So the decisions of what the voice would address or advise are those really drastic, urgent questions that need addressing. If not, we are throwing good money after bad and generations after generations are lost to bad policy. Thank you.
I was looking for a bit of gender balance there. I didn't realise this was a dangerous job.
I've got a very, very simple question. and I have a list here of 54 Aboriginal organisations. What is going to happen to them if the yes vote is successful, please? Thank you.
I don't quite understand the premise of your question, because it's an advisory body. It has support of 80%, over 80% of Indigenous communities. Sure. But again, on what premise do you consider those organisations will be in some way disbanded? They will form part of the communities that will feed up the representatives to the voice to ensure that rather than just having their localised impact, they have that opportunity to give advice on the national stage to the Parliament, but also to the Executive. Because I do have to reinforce, policies are cooked up, for want of a better word. They have to be developed by the Executive. By the time they come to Parliament, we can make amendments, we can tweak them, we can highlight discrepancies. It's very hard to change direction of a poorly developed policy, right? And it becomes so polarised. So all these organisations will have the opportunity to feed into the consultation process to develop the voice. That's the very point, that they will have a much greater impact. I don't see anywhere in the proposals that says these organisations are disbanded.
Nicolette, you want to say something on this?
I had the honour recently of talking with United Church of Australia about this, and I heard from someone who's involved in a local Aboriginal, probably one of the organisations on the sheet, and their story goes like this. We have a Department of Aboriginal Affairs, but frankly, the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs is answerable to the Minister who's answerable to a party. And so the Voice, why they are excited about the Voice, is that they can provide fearless and frank feedback through the Voice about things that aren't working or about things that might be improved if their views taken into account, which they don't have those same reliable channels through what is essentially a politically motivated organisation.
Thank you.
I'm just going to, because it's important for the Aboriginal person that is representing an Aboriginal organisation as well, in response to that. I'm the CEO of Welcome to Country. We represent 200 First Nations, almost 200 First Nations businesses all around Australia. When we were deciding on how to position ourselves and how do we represent those Indigenous First Nations businesses all around Australia, we surveyed them. And the majority, a large, overwhelming majority of those almost 200 First Nations businesses all around Australia highly supported the Voice to Parliament.
Ladies and gentlemen, I suspect we could ask and answer questions for hours, but we are on a very tight timeline with this building. I don't know if any of you have ever sat in a synod in Rome, but what happens there is that when your time is up, the Pope just flicks your microphone and everything goes dead. And pretty much the same thing is going to happen here in a very short time. So we are going to have to vacate this hall sooner than we would like. Nevertheless, we are very grateful that we've been able to host you here today. If you look at your leaflet, there's something there that I would call a call to action. It's on the back of it. It says, what can I do or how can I help if I want to support the Voice? So the first thing you can do is register for Bradfield for Yes and look at all the local events. It's very active, and my colleagues Kerry and Nick are there, and if you want to ask any questions about that, they would be only too happy to talk to you afterwards, outside the building, after we get locked out. The next thing you might like to do is pledge your vote to Yes23. You can do that on their website. We're also hosting a yarning session with the Uluru Youth Dialogue on Sunday, August the 20th. We're calling it a Youth Dialogue, and we are hoping that lots of young people come to it, but I can see that everyone in this room is young at heart, so if you want to be part of that Youth Dialogue, please sign up. You can talk to your friends and family. I don't know about you, but I've got some people in my family that are telling me that they're voting no, and we have very interesting conversations across the chalk. And the next thing you might like to do is wear a t-shirt and be a human billboard. So there are many things that you can do if you want to support the Voice. There are a few people that I would like to thank for this afternoon. First of all, can I ask you to thank these brilliant people? I can tell you that the calls on their time are extraordinary, and their generosity is also extraordinary. So thank you to all of you. Thank Stuart, who's hiding here behind the microphones, for all the work that he did to make sure that you were able to do it. And can I also thank the army of volunteers who have been registering you and leafleting you and hoping that you are able to come along today to hear these speakers. If you would like to find out more about the work of Voices of Bradfield, we will be having our AGM on Sunday, August the 6th. You are more than welcome to come along, because that's where we set our priorities for 2024. So if you want to get in on the ground floor, that's the place to start. Finally, I would like to quote from one of my favourite authors. Her name is Geraldine Brooks. She's a writer, a journalist. She's an Australian who currently lives in America. She wrote an opinion piece that was published in the SMH and the Age yesterday. She talked about the Trumpian influence on the no vote. So it's really worth having a look at what she wrote. But I just want to finish with her last sentence. She said, 82% of First Nations people are for the Voice. 82%. That's a lot of voices. I only hope that the rest of us can hear them.